He didn't just ask me to leave, he celebrated it. That's what stayed with me the most. Not the words, not the argument, not even the moment I stepped outside with nothing but what I could carry. It was what came after, the laughter. The tone, the way the situation shifted from something serious into something almost entertaining for him, and that's when it stopped feeling like a disagreement. It became something else entirely. Because when someone turns a moment like that into a celebration, it reveals something deeper than anger. It shows perspective. And perspective, once exposed like that, doesn't change quickly. I didn't argue. Not because I didn't have anything to say, but because I understood something in that moment. Nothing I said would land the way I intended. Not there, not then, so I walked out, not dramatically, not with resistance, just quietly. Because sometimes the strongest response isn't to fight the moment, it's to let it happen and see what follows. The door closed behind me, and with it, something else closed too. Not just access to a place, but access to a version of a relationship I had assumed still existed. Because up until that moment, I believed there were limits, lines that wouldn't be crossed, reactions that wouldn't go that far. And when those assumptions break, they don't just change how you see the moment, they change how you see everything that came before it. I stood there for a few seconds longer than necessary, not waiting for anything to change, but acknowledging that it wouldn't. Because once something reaches that point, it doesn't reverse immediately. It settles first, and then it reveals what it really means over time. I didn't go far that night, not physically, because distance wasn't what I needed, it was clarity. And clarity doesn't come from moving quickly. It comes from understanding what just happened without trying to reshape it into something easier to accept. I found a place to sit, not comfortable, not familiar, just available. And I stayed there longer than I expected, not thinking about solutions, not planning what to do next, just replaying the moment, not to change it, but to see it clearly. Because when something feels unreal, your first instinct is to question it, to look for something you missed, some detail that would make it make sense. But sometimes there isn't one. Sometimes the moment is exactly what it looked like. The next morning didn't bring answers, it brought reality. And reality doesn't wait for understanding. It moves forward whether you're ready or not. There were things to figure out, where to go, what to do, how to rebuild structure without what I had relied on for so long. And none of those things felt clear, but they didn't need to be clear immediately. They just needed to begin. Because when everything changes at once, progress doesn't start with direction, it starts with movement. Small, consistent movement that doesn't rely on certainty. What stayed with me more than anything else wasn't the fact that I had been asked to leave. It was how it was done, the tone, the reaction, the celebration. Because moments like that don't come from nowhere, they're built over time, through things that weren't addressed, through perceptions that formed without being corrected, and understanding that didn't make it easier, but it made it clearer. Because clarity removes confusion, even when it doesn't remove discomfort. I didn't contact him after that, not out of pride, not out of anger, but because I knew something important. Anything said too soon would come from reaction, not understanding. And reactions, especially in moments like that, don't fix anything. They just extend the situation. So I stayed silent, not as avoidance, but as control. Days passed, then more. And slowly, without any announcement, something began to shift, not around me, but within me. Because when you're removed from something suddenly, you start seeing it differently, not emotionally, structurally. You begin to understand what was actually there and what you thought was there, and sometimes those two things aren't the same. I focused on rebuilding, not everything at once, just enough to create stability again. Because stability, even in small amounts, creates something important, momentum. And momentum always leads somewhere. He just didn't realize where it was about to lead him. Looking back at that night, the celebration didn't feel random anymore. At first, it seemed like an overreaction, something emotional, impulsive, disconnected from the weight of what had actually happened. But as the days passed and as I started to see things with more distance, it began to make sense in a different way. Not as a reaction to the moment, but as a reflection of something that had been building long before it. Because people don't celebrate decisions like that unless, in their mind, it represents a form of release. Not from a single situation, but from something they've been carrying over time. And that realization shifted how I viewed everything, because it meant that what happened that night wasn't just about me leaving. It was about how he had come to see me. His life from the outside had always looked stable, structured, comfortable in ways that didn't require constant effort. And for a long time, I believed that stability was something I had created for him. something that allowed him to focus on his own direction without worrying about the foundation underneath it. But what I didn't fully consider was how that same stability might have been interpreted differently from his perspective. Because when something is always there, always consistent, always reliable, it stops being seen as effort. It becomes expectation, and expectation, when unchallenged, turns into entitlement. There were signs of it even before that night. Small things, subtle shifts in how he approached situations, the way he spoke about responsibilities. The way he assumed certain things would always be handled, not aggressively, not disrespectfully on the surface, but with a level of certainty that didn't leave much room for awareness of what it took to maintain those things. And I didn't correct it, not directly, because at the time it didn't seem urgent. It felt manageable, temporary, something that would adjust on its own as he gained more experience. But experience doesn't always come automatically. Sometimes it requires disruption, something that breaks the pattern enough to reveal what was hidden within it. And that's exactly what that night had done. Not just for me, but for him too, even if he didn't realize it yet. Because the moment I left, something fundamental changed in his environment, not visibly at first, not dramatically, but structurally. The things I used to handle quietly, the ones that never needed attention because they were always taken care of, were no longer being managed. And when those things stop functioning, they don't announce themselves all at once. They appear gradually, small inconsistencies at first, minor disruptions, the kind that are easy to ignore in the beginning, but over time they accumulate. And when they accumulate, they start to affect everything else. At first, he probably didn't connect those changes directly to my absence, because when something has always been stable, you don't immediately realize what was holding it together. You just notice that it isn't the same anymore, and that difference doesn't feel significant until it starts interfering with your routine, your expectations, your ability to function the way you're used to. By the end of the first week, those small disruptions would have started to become more noticeable. Things taking longer than expected, situations not resolving the way they usually did. Processes that once felt automatic now requiring effort, and effort, when it's unfamiliar, feels heavier than it actually is. That's when perspective begins to shift, not instantly, but gradually. Because once you're forced to handle things you didn't have to think about before, you start seeing them differently, not as background, but as responsibility. And responsibility changes how you view everything connected to it. The second week is where it becomes clearer, because by then the initial adjustment period has passed. What felt temporary starts to feel consistent, and consistency, even in difficulty, creates realization. The kind that can't be ignored anymore, and that's when the question changes. From "why did this happen?" to "how do I fix this?" By the time the second week settled in, the shift was no longer subtle. It wasn't something that could be ignored or explained away as temporary adjustment. It had become consistent enough to demand attention. The structure he had been relying on without fully realizing it was no longer holding things together. And when structure disappears, everything that depends on it begins to loosen. Not all at once, but in ways that make daily life feel heavier than it should. Decisions take longer. Simple tasks feel more complicated. And the sense of control starts to slip, not dramatically, but noticeably. That's when realization begins, not as a sudden understanding, but as a gradual recognition that something fundamental has changed. The comfort he once operated within had been replaced by effort. And effort, when it's unfamiliar, doesn't feel productive, it feels exhausting, because it requires attention in areas that were once automatic. Things that used to function quietly in the background were now demanding focus. And focus, when spread across too many new responsibilities at once, creates pressure. Not external pressure, but internal. The kind that builds without being immediately visible. The kind that affects how you think, how you react, how you handle even the smallest disruptions. And that pressure doesn't need a major event to become overwhelming. It grows through accumulation. At some point, the connection would have started to form, not clearly at first, but enough to raise a question, a recognition that the timing of everything didn't feel random. That the changes he was experiencing weren't isolated, they were connected. And once that connection begins to take shape, it's difficult to ignore, because it forces you to look at the situation differently. Not from the position of control, but from the position of dependency. And dependency, once exposed, changes everything. Because it reveals something people don't always want to see, that what they believed was independence was actually supported by something else. Something consistent, something reliable, something that doesn't stand out until it's no longer there. That realization doesn't feel comfortable. It doesn't feel empowering. It feels unsettling. Because it challenges the narrative you've been operating within. It forces you to reconsider decisions that felt justified at the time. And when those decisions start to show consequences, they don't feel as certain anymore. The celebration from that night, whatever it meant in that moment, wouldn't feel the same now because perspective had shifted, not completely, not instantly, but enough to create contrast. And contrast reveals things more clearly than anything else. What once felt like control now felt like loss. What once felt like independence now felt like responsibility. And what once felt like a final decision now felt like something that needed to be reversed. But reversal isn't immediate. It comes with hesitation, because reaching out means acknowledging something. Not just the situation, but the mistake. An acknowledgement, especially when it challenges your own decisions, takes time. That's why the call didn't come right away, not in the first week, not even at the beginning of the second. Because before someone reaches out, they try to fix things on their own, to regain control, to prove mostly to themselves that they don't need to go back. But when those attempts don't work, the options start to narrow, and when options narrow enough, clarity becomes unavoidable. The call came late, not at a dramatic hour, not with urgency in the timing, but with something else in the tone. Something that hadn't been there before. I looked at the screen for a moment before answering, not out of hesitation, but out of recognition, because some moments don't need to be rushed. They need to be understood before they're engaged. When I answered, there was a pause, not long but noticeable, the kind of pause that carries weight because it holds everything that hasn't been said yet. "Can we talk?" he said. The words were simple, but the tone behind them was completely different, and in that moment, the shift was clear. I didn't answer him immediately, not because I wanted to delay it, but because I understood what that question carried. "Can we talk?" wasn't just a request, it was a shift. A movement from certainty to uncertainty, from control to reconsideration. And those transitions don't happen lightly. They come after something has already changed internally. So instead of responding right away, I let the moment settle, not to create distance, but to respect what it represented. Because when someone reaches out like that after silence, the response matters. Not just in what is said, but in how it's said. And I didn't want to respond from reaction. I wanted to respond from clarity. "Yes," I said finally, just one word, no extra tone, no added weight. Because the conversation didn't need to start with explanation, it needed to start with openness. We agreed to meet not at his place, not at mine, but somewhere neutral. A place without history, without association. Because sometimes removing the environment removes the pressure that comes with it. And pressure in moments like this doesn't help, it limits. When I arrived, he was already there. Sitting, not restless, not impatient, just still. And that stillness was different from what I remembered. It didn't carry the same certainty it once did. It felt quieter, more aware, and that awareness showed before a single word was spoken. Because people don't need to say they've changed, you can see it in how they hold themselves. He looked up when I approached, not quickly, not with urgency, just enough to acknowledge that I was there, and in that moment there was no tension. No visible discomfort, just a kind of quiet recognition that something needed to be addressed but not forced. "I didn't handle that well," he said after a moment. Direct, no build-up, no attempt to soften it with explanation first. And that mattered because accountability, when it comes without justification, carries more weight than any apology shaped by defense. I didn't respond immediately, not because I disagreed, but because I didn't need to confirm it right away. Sometimes letting words sit for a moment gives them more meaning than reacting to them instantly. "I thought I had everything under control," he continued. "I thought I didn't need anything outside of what I was already managing." He paused, not searching for words, but acknowledging something he had already understood internally. "And I was wrong." That sentence didn't carry frustration. It carried clarity. The kind that doesn't come from being told, but from experiencing something directly. And experience, unlike advice, doesn't need repetition to be understood. "I tried to fix it," he said, "on my own. For days, I thought it was just temporary, that things would adjust." He looked down briefly, then back up. But they didn't. There was no need to ask what he meant because I already understood. Not from assumption, but from experience. Because I had gone through my own version of that realization, just from a different position. I didn't realize how much. He stopped again, not struggling, but choosing how to say it. How much was being handled without me noticing? And that was it, not a full explanation, not a detailed breakdown, just enough to reveal what had changed. Because once awareness reaches that point, it doesn't need to be expanded, it needs to be acknowledged. "I need your help," he said finally, not rushed, not forced, just clear. And that moment, that was the real shift, not because he asked, but because he understood why he had to. I looked at him for a moment, not evaluating, not judging, just observing, because the situation wasn't about proving anything anymore. It wasn't about right or wrong. It was about alignment. "I'm not coming back the same way," I said, calmly, clearly, not as rejection but as boundary, because growth doesn't mean returning to the exact structure that created the problem. He nodded, immediately, without hesitation. Because this time he wasn't holding onto control, he was open to change. "I understand," he said, and this time it wasn't just a response, it was recognition. We didn't solve everything in that moment. We didn't rebuild everything instantly, but something important happened. We reset the foundation, not based on assumption, not based on habit, but based on awareness. And awareness changes everything that comes after it. The relationship didn't return to what it was. It evolved into something else, something more defined, more balanced, less dependent on unspoken expectations, because expectations were what created the distance in the first place. And understanding was what closed it. He didn't celebrate anymore. He paid attention. And that difference was everything. I didn't lose everything that night. I just lost the illusion that everything was already understood.